Hello. Today, by way of a role play, we're going to look at how to handle difficult employees. Characteristics of a difficult employee, well, not very cooperative, aggressive on occasions, come out with phrases such as let's agree to disagree, really getting in the way of a good business and how it should be run smoothly. In terms of what I say to clients is, don't ignore these issues, don't ignore these people. It's a bit like the dripping water pipe in your house. If you ignore it, it's going to come back and it's going to cause problems for you. It never goes away. In terms of the role play, we're going to meet Frank Cannell, who runs a business. Within the business, an accounts manager, Dave out there. Dave, difficult character, Frank will say, has some of these characteristics we've talked about, problems with him in the past. Things have come to a head a little bit now because he's starting to upset his team that he manages. He's also upset a particular client. So the role play that we'll turn to shortly will deal with those particular items. In terms of key learning points, by the end of the session, we hope that you will have picked up the particular issues. The first one will be how to deal with a relationship breakdown between this particular manager and members of staff, and whether that could be possibly a reason for the dismissal of the manager. Second point will be how to deal with a relationship breakdown with a customer. Again, is that going to be the basis of a fair reason to dismiss this difficult employee? Third point, bringing those two together, just examining, Sarah Hall will examine the different reasons that can be used by an employer to fairly dismiss someone. We'll now go to the meeting between the solicitor and Mr. Cannell.
Hi Frank, thanks for coming in today. You sent me an email in advance of the meeting, and I think there's a few points you want to cover off today.
Yes, it's about Difficult Dave. He's our accounts manager, been with us for about 3 years, promoted a year ago. He's been upsetting a lot of people. I know he's got personal problems, but he's upset a major client, and I just need to discuss matters with you as to how I handle him and the situation that he's creating.
Okay, so in the email you mentioned 3 points you'd like to talk about today. The first is the major client.
That's right.
You just mentioned. Secondly is his team are now refusing to work with him, is that right?
Yes, well, so I'm told.
Okay, and the third point is you asked the question, would there be a fair reason to dismiss Dave?
Yes, it's come to the point where, you know, we're trying to run a business here and he's preventing that happening because he is upsetting a lot of people.
Okay, so in terms of the first point, the client who is now refusing to work with Dave, have you got any detail as to why the client is saying that?
No, it's only what has been said by Bob, one of our directors, who took him out for a meal after we had the meeting. I was in a meeting with Dave and the client, and things got a bit touchy at one point. And I believe, from what Bob has said, following the meal in the evening, that the client was unhappy with what had been said by Dave to him.
Right, but we don't know what that is yet.
Well, no,
Okay.
I haven't drilled down into the detail, hence coming to see you to see what I do.
That's fine. And how important is this client to your business? Are we talking about a major client, a relatively small client?
Oh, he's one of the major clients, so he provides a significant part of our income stream.
That's fine. And has that client said what they want to happen in respect of Dave? Has there been any discussions along those lines?
Well, I haven't actually spoken to Bob further. Bob just mentioned it to me, not in passing, but as a complaint.
Okay.
Hence, I've contacted you because I think I've got to now deal with the situation. And I don't know how to approach the client or even Dave about it.
Okay, that's fine. What we need to do is, first of all, carry out a full investigation. Because this complaint has come from the client, the starting point really needs to be with the client. And what I'd suggest is we arrange a meeting where you go along, speak to the client, try and find out exactly what has happened, see if the client is prepared to give us that level of detail, and ideally to have that all put forward in a statement. Yeah. What we also need to establish is, what does the client want to happen? Because if realistically the client has now moved on and is happy to keep working with Dave, despite what they said previously, then that's something we need to take into account when deciding how we deal with Dave. On the other hand, it might be the other extreme, of course. They might be saying, unless you get rid of Dave, we're going to take our business elsewhere. And we really need to know what the client's view is on that. How do you feel about meeting with the client? Because I appreciate that could be a little bit sensitive.
I may have to get Bob to do that,
Okay.
but it is a major client and we could not afford to lose this client, Sarah.
Okay. So do you think there's a positive in meeting with the client anyway to try and build bridges, if you like, even if they aren't prepared to put a statement forward?
Well, certainly we would have to do that
Okay.
as a business. We could not afford to let this ride, and I think we do need to meet with the client, but it's how we approach the client and
Yeah.
what we can ask and say to him and what we can ask from him.
I mean, what you have to, be careful about is showing you haven't prejudged any of the issues. You certainly wouldn't want to make any promises to the client that you were going to dismiss Dave or anything along those lines. But what you can say is that you are investigating the complaint that has been made and trying to gather all of the relevant information. In terms of Dave, the key stage is once you've got that information, is speaking to him about it. And what I'd suggest again is an investigation meeting. So make it clear to him that a client has complained, give him full details of those complaints, and give him the opportunity to put his side of the story, his version of events.
Okay.
Has anyone spoken to him yet about the complaint?
I've spoken in passing about it,
Okay.
and that's when he became a bit aggressive with me about it.
Right.
Which obviously I was a bit shocked by his reaction, but I'd rather have Bob investigate rather than myself,
Yeah.
because I was actually at the meeting.
Absolutely, I agree with that. It may be that you actually need to prepare a statement in terms of the meeting, and also if there has been any behaviour by Dave since which is inappropriate, like aggressive behaviour,
Yeah.
that may well form part of this investigation. As I say, the purpose of the investigation meeting with Dave is really his first opportunity to put his version of events. But what we also need to explore is if there's been any really mitigating circumstances. So, for example, has he been provoked by the client? The client may give us his version of events. There may be a history here. There may have been something particular that happened at that meeting that provoked Dave. We would need that type of detail to take a fair decision, really.
Okay.
The other possible mitigating circumstance is whether, for example, he's been suffering from stress. And I know you mentioned personal problems.
He's had personal problems, obviously a new baby, and I think he's been struggling with it. He works long hours.
Right.
And he's been off on the sick. Now, I haven't checked his sick notes, but I'm told by HR that there's been anxiety and stress, and he's been off for a week here and a couple of days there.
Is that over the last few months that you mentioned in your email, or is this going on over
No,
the 3 years?
well, it's not over 3 years. It's just over the past couple of months.
Okay.
Sarah.
That's fine. Well, it certainly sounds like that's something we need to look at as part of the investigation. What we shouldn't do is just ignore the fact, because, as I say, it may well be relevant to his behaviour and something that we should be seen to be taking into account. Doesn't mean you can't do anything about what he's done.
Okay.
It just means you need all of the facts to decide the appropriate course of action. And certainly if there have been real personal problems, if there's a health issue, stress or otherwise, it might be that we're actually following a different route rather than the disciplinary route with Dave. But we can talk about that when we've
Okay.
got the detail. So the next issue you mention is the accounts team, Dave's team, refusing to work with him.
Yes, there's obviously 10 people in the team,
Right.
and we rely upon them obviously to generate income. And they've been unhappy with Dave. In fact, one or two of them have been going off sick, having odd
Right.
days off, which has created a problem for us. And I'm being told by other people in our other departments that they are complaining, they're very unhappy, but no one's approached me as yet.
Right, okay. That's fine, but you're getting the feeling this is building up, don't you?
Well, I walked in yesterday and there was obviously an atmosphere there, I
Right.
could tell. And people had their heads down, they weren't communicating, because normally we're quite chatty, we have a bit of banter, but it was like a morgue.
So when you mentioned in your email Dave being uncooperative, Dave being aggressive, I know you've mentioned one incident when he was
Yeah.
aggressive with you. Have you seen anything directly, or is this all through word of mouth?
It's all through word of mouth. Obviously, I had one or two words with Dave in the cafeteria, as we were passing, and I just commented about the atmosphere there.
Right.
And again, he just snapped at me.
Right.
And I was trying to say, what's all this about? And he goes, you know what it's about. And I just left it there.
And do you know what it's about?
Well, no, I don't.
Okay.
And I'm just cautious about approaching him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think given the fact that you've now got a number of people, it may not be all 10, I appreciate that, but a number of people raising concerns about him, and to the extent where they're saying we're refusing to work with him, you do need now to formally investigate it, not only for the good of the business in terms of them working together day to day, but also the fact that people may start to leave, of course. Look for jobs elsewhere. You might end up losing some good people unless you deal with this. The worst case scenario, of course, is that those employees actually bring claims against you for not supporting them.
Well, that does concern me because, the atmosphere has changed dramatically.
Okay.
And there's staff that we wouldn't want to lose for obvious reasons because they provide a very good income stream into the business.
And you've already mentioned sick days, so that's impacting on income stream, and also suggesting that there's a serious issue here which we need to resolve.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. From your position, as I say, as a company, what you need to be seen to be doing is taking these complaints seriously. But at the moment, we don't have enough detail to know whether we're talking about a disciplinary route for Dave or not. So again, we need some investigation meetings lined up, and that's with the accounts team. What we don't want to do is just speak to those employees who've brought the complaints. This needs to be balanced. We need to speak to an appropriate number of people to get a fair reflection of what's actually been happening.
Okay.
We may, of course, find that Dave's got some supporters in there. It may not be negative comments throughout, especially when he's been with you 3 years.
Okay.
Do you know of anybody in particular who might support him?
Well, there's one or two of the male members that he tends to go away on weekends with.
Right.
He's very much into adventure sports, cycling, mountain biking, all that.
Okay.
And he's been very pally with them.
So we need to try and get a balanced view.
Yeah,
in
they
terms
may
of
be
that.
a good people to start with, really, and I can get someone to speak to them as well.
Okay. Well, what we'll do in terms of the investigation, we'll be consistent, so we'll speak to everybody in the same way, we'll ask appropriate questions, and really what we're trying to get to the bottom of is what are the concerns here, what has actually happened to get them to the point of saying we won't work with him anymore. We need as much detail as possible. We don't want general sweeping allegations, we want detail that we can then put to Dave, and he again can have his response before we decide how we're going to deal with this. I think what we also need to know from the team is how do they want this to be resolved. Again, if we actually sit down with them, we might find that what they're saying is, well, as long as somebody, for example, has a word with Dave and this doesn't happen again, we're happy to carry on working. It might, of course, be the other extreme in terms of someone saying, either he goes or I go.
Yeah.
And we need to sort that out. And also we need to assess how reasonable that is. And we'll only know that when we know the detail of what's been happening here. Once we've got the necessary information, we'll have the investigation meeting with Dave. And I'd suggest you do just one investigation meeting where you speak to him about both the client issue and also the team issues. You don't want to keep dragging him in at different times and putting new allegations to him. So we'd have the one investigation meeting. Again, you'd go through the similar information. You'd put everything to him and ask for his explanation.
Okay. Who would do that? Because obviously I've already had one or two issues with him. Again, I can get Bob to do that as part of his investigation.
Yeah, if Bob was dealt with as the investigation officer, you stay completely out of it. You may, of course, need to provide statements, as I said, but you wouldn't be involved going forward either in the investigation or any future disciplinary process.
Okay, that's fine by me.
One thing we have to assess when we're talking about colleagues raising complaints about the other is whether there might be any hidden agendas here. So again, as part of the investigation process, it's trying to establish if there might be any motive behind the complaints that are being made. We'll only know that once we start asking the right questions, and all of that information will come out. Again, at the meeting with Dave, he's given full opportunity to explain what he says happened, and also any explanation, so the personal circumstances. He may not be prepared to give very much detail about that, but we need to give him the opportunity.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll give you Bob's contact details, his email address, and I'll tell him what we've discussed, and you can email through him some bullet points
That's fine.
and a template as to what he has to do. I know we've got our grievance disciplinary policy, but it'd just be helpful to, if you could assist Bob with what he has to go through.
That's fine. The questions are key at this early stage. We need to make sure we ask all the right questions so we're not going back and trying to get bits of information at a later date. And then your last question, and I appreciate we're at an early stage in the process, but have you potentially got a fair reason for dismissal?
Yes, what's in my mind is that I can replace Dave. The staff I'd find more difficult, and I'd want to keep that team working because it's been very productive.
Okay,
And I just think Dave's lost the plot.
right.
And my concern is that he's the root cause, people complaining about him, and frankly, I think he's the one that has to go. We have to make that decision.
Okay. What's important is that you don't make the decision now, that we gather all of the information and we see what we're dealing with in terms of Dave's behaviour and also the relationship breakdowns between client and the team. There's two potentially fair reasons for dismissal. That doesn't mean you can jump straight in and dismiss, but there are two potentially fair reasons, and they are misconduct or some other substantial reason. You'll have come across misconduct before.
Yes, I've not come across some other substantial reason.
Okay.
What's that, Sarah?
It's a catch-all fair reason for dismissal. It's only a potentially fair reason. But basically, if it doesn't fall within the misconduct, let's say, for example, that we get all of this information and yes, Dave's behaviour has been unacceptable to a certain level, but it's not enough to warrant dismissal straight away. Realistically, the majority of misconduct cases should be dealt with a warning. The majority aren't gross misconduct. So if we look at it just as a misconduct case, we might think Dave deserves the opportunity to improve. He deserves a warning, clear line drawn in the sand to say to him, this behaviour is not appropriate and this is what we expect. And if that is the case and you decided to dismiss, a tribunal might criticise you for that and hold it's an unfair dismissal.
Okay.
But what we're also dealing with here is breakdown in relationship. And there is some very helpful case law which says that if you've got a relationship breakdown either with a client or with other colleagues, that can fall within some other substantial reason for dismissal. But it has to be substantial. If it is a case that, in fact, when we look at it, these relationship breakdowns can be fixed. So if, for example, we could arrange mediation for this to work, or we could move Dave into a different team, or he could work at a different office. In other words, there's an alternative to dismissal, then we're probably not going to fall within a fair reason for dismissal, even under some other substantial reason. But what is helpful to know is that you've got options here.
Okay.
What we need to make sure is we're on the right process. We do not want to be on a gross misconduct dismissal route if in fact there isn't enough to support a gross misconduct dismissal. We'd want to make sure, for example, with some other substantial reason, that we're getting enough detail about the relationship breakdowns, alternatives, that type of thing. Of course, what we said earlier on is what we may be looking at here is some health issues, some personal problems. So even if we potentially fall within some other substantial reason for dismissal, we still have to act reasonably. And if it turns out that, Dave's been a good employee for 3 years, but in the last few months he's got personal problems that we can offer support and help with, we may find we're on a capability process, a management, a supportive process rather than a disciplinary one.
Okay, it sounds quite complex, that, Sarah. I thought it was quite easy. He's upsetting people. Can we get rid of him?
Possibly can, but until we've got all of the information, we don't know which procedure you're on. And until, as I say, we find out the exact detail of what he's done and the effect of that in terms of his relationships going forward, we can't say.
Well, I think we would want to do things fairly quickly because the impact it is having on the business now, financially. And I think my fellow directors have given me a brief to speak to you to see what can we do and how quickly we can move it forward.
We should move it forward very quickly. Meetings should be set up straight away with the client and all of the accounts team.
Okay.
As soon as we've got that information, meeting with Dave, and once you've got that level of detail, we're going to know, is it appropriate to progress it to, for example, a disciplinary hearing.
Great. Well, I'll give you Bob's details. if you can do something today, that'd be really
yeah,
helpful.
no problem at all.
Brilliant.
Great. Thanks for coming
Okay,
in.
thanks a lot, Sarah.
Okay, to summarise, key learning points. First one in respect to the staff. Very important that you deal with this. You don't want your good members of staff leaving because of the difficult member of staff that you're ignoring. May leave, may bring a claim. Want to avoid that. Also, you always want to retain your good people. Need to investigate though. Second point in respect to the customer. Try and mend those bridges. If, however, the customer is saying, Dave out there must go, he cannot be in your organisation anymore, then set that up by way of statements, by way of evidence to support a dismissal. Third point, appreciate the difference between a conduct reason and a some other substantial reason. Conduct, is it big enough to be gross misconduct because this is an end game without a warning? If not, you can go to the breakdown in trust and confidence supported by the staff or the customers. Thank you. That concludes. Can I recommend that you look to pod number 2 on the MBS TV website that deals with the next stage in this story, which is how to handle a disciplinary hearing involving Dave out there. Thank you. Goodbye.